Last fall, we launched our podcast, In These Times, with an examination of COVID-19 and its far-reaching impacts. This season, we're focusing on Black lives and exploring the nation's complex history with race. We'll consider some challenging questions. Who controls the narrative about the U.S.? How far have we moved beyond our history of enslavement and Jim Crow? Are we at a moment of reckoning? In these times, knowledge is more important than ever.
As the number of cases and deaths continues to mount, a clearer picture is forming of the disproportionate toll COVID-19 is having on Black people and communities of color. In New York City, Blacks and Hispanics are dying at roughly twice the rate of whites. In Chicago, Blacks are dying at nearly 3 times the rate of whites. And in New Mexico, Native Americans account for more than half of all confirmed cases, despite being only 11% of the population.
When COVID-19 delivered a disproportionate blow to communities of color in the form of higher rates of serious complications and death, environmental hazards like air pollution, that are all too frequently present in these communities, was one of the contributing factors cited by experts.
In fact, people living in the most polluted areas are indeed 15% more likely to die from coronavirus than those living in places where pollution is only slightly lower.
The idea that race is a factor in determining who has access to resources that allow a community to thrive is not so much news as it is part of the American story. It's a chapter that, some have said, began when native tribes from the east of the Mississippi were driven along the Trail of Tears to arid lands of the West. Today, there is a wider recognition that environmental racism is one of the many forms of systematic racism. And increasingly, there is recognition that environmental justice and climate change are interconnected problems. In this episode, we'll hear perspectives from a professor of English, a college senior, and a sociologist on what it means to live under a system of environmental racism and how to move forward towards environmental justice. Welcome to Episode 5, Environmental Justice and Race. Earlier this season, we heard from experts who discussed the problem of residential segregation and how mechanisms like redlining and urban renewal, the state-sponsored raising and redevelopment of supposedly blighted neighborhoods, were used to define African American spaces. Today we hear from Herman Beavers about how these spaces reflect environmental racism as seen through the lens of literature. A poet and the Julie Beren Platt and Marc E. Platt President's Distinguished Professor of English and Africana Studies, Dr. Beavers teaches courses on Southern modernism, 20th century African American poetry, and the literatures of jazz. He's currently at work on an essay that considers how Black bodies negotiate urban space in the context of modernist literature.
What I'm getting back to working on is an essay for a volume being produced by Cambridge on the culture of jazz. And I've been asked to write about jazz fiction. But the way that I want to approach that is to think about, one, the fact that we go back to the 1920s and a novel like The Great Gatsby. The Great Gatsby, which is produced in what is often known as the Jazz Age, The Great Gatsby is a novel that is very much about race. We don't really think of it that way, but it's very much about race. It's very much about the anxieties that Black bodies produce when you start talking about people negotiating urban space. And so one of the things that I'm really interested in is what I'm calling the epidemiology of modernism, which is to say that in the 1920s, just as people are saying, in the present moment, in the 2020s, that racism is a public health issue. In the 1920s, when there were lynchings happening in the South at the rate sometimes of one per day, racism was a public health issue then also. And so I'm interested in the sort of epidemiology of modernism because jazz as a modernist phenomenon, comes out of the cultural intersections that take place in places like Harlem and places like Manhattan. And so the idea of white people getting in taxis in downtown Manhattan and going up to Harlem to enjoy jazz at the Cotton Club where Black people are not allowed to be patrons, when you think about the stress that puts on Black people, the idea that there are places that you can't go, that white people can go and enjoy what is essentially your culture, a cultural practice that came out of your cultural lineage. One of the things that the epidemiology of modernism is in many ways about is the ways that the dominant culture appropriates the culture, in this case of African Americans, and makes it their own.
In the fall of 2019, Professor Beavers delivered a micro talk on campus as part of a series of 1.5-minute climate lectures, where he considers the inequitable social outcomes associated with this geography of race. In that talk, he discussed 2 examples from literature where the lives of African American characters are, in some way, at the mercy of the climate.
One of the things that I thought about was, could I find instances where climate was impactful on Black people's lives? And the examples that I used, one was from Toni Morrison's novel Sula, and the other was from a Paul Laurence Dunbar poem that he wrote in the late 19th century called A Warm Day in Winter. And both the novel and the poem are about unseasonable days in the wintertime. So the Dunbar poem is about what happens on a plantation when there's like a spring thaw and all of a sudden the weather turns warm. And what Dunbar describes is a moment where the slaves are sort of freed from their usual labors in the fields to having leisure time because the master of the plantation and the mistress are engaged in their own forms of leisure. And so all of a sudden the slaves get to be human beings. And, this is a poem that I've taught many, many times. And what I always tell students is, what does it mean that Black people's humanity is pegged to an anomalous instance in climate? That you get to be a human being in the wintertime when winter is acting like spring or winter is acting like summer. And as I thought about that, it really speaks to the manner in which Black communities have often been victims of, contingent on their relationship to the climate. So the 20th century, the late 20th century example of that obviously is Hurricane Katrina.
Professor Beavers observes that in Philadelphia, the luxury of shade trees is a sign of how environmental justice is often denied to Black communities. But he also notes that achieving environmental justice will require a break from old patterns of gentrification, where neighborhoods get cleaner and greener while displacing the people of color who live in them.
But one of the things that I thought about was, in West Philadelphia, Black communities have a lot less in the way of canopy cover, shade, than white communities do. In part because the trees are torn down, in part because, nobody thinks that Black people care about living in green spaces. There are a variety of reasons. But when you think about that, when you think about the ways in which Black communities are on average 5 to 10 degrees hotter in the middle of the summer than white communities because they don't have shade, that speaks to the manner in which all of this talk about climate justice is really pegged and racialized toward white communities. So one of the things I talked about at the end of my lecture was these instances where gentrification is happening and people are moving back into urban spaces and creating these green housing circumstances so that they get to be the heroic figures in the climate change narrative. And the Black people who are fighting against gentrification and not wanting to be displaced, they get portrayed as the villains. And so what my lecture ends with is Martin Luther King's admonition, we can either live together as brothers and sisters, or we can perish together as fools. Well, the climate change moment strikes me as being a moment where we really need to think about that, because historically, white people have served themselves and Black people got served with what the dregs were, or they were completely left out, right? So if you look at the Ninth Ward in New Orleans, people just abandoned that community. And that community, we shouldn't be surprised at what happened in the Ninth Ward. It was already a community under duress. And so I have a former student who's in New Orleans, and he keeps me up to date on what's going on. The Ninth Ward is being gentrified. So all of those people that live there who might have wanted to come back, they can't return to the Ninth Ward because it's slowly being gentrified. And so white people are moving in, all of these bars and boutiques and coffee shops are popping up. And, stores that people who are sort of working class, working poor folk can't afford to patronize. So when you think about it, gentrification and climate change go hand in hand. And I wanted to make sure in my lecture that people understood that we can't make the climate change narrative a narrative that is not sensitive to racial difference and racial injustice.
I'm Lucy, and here in Philly, you can smell climate change. Exploding sewers, flooding sinkholes, and a rapidly multiplying mosquito population show how my city's infrastructure will collapse under increased rainfall and extreme heat.
I'm Grace from South Africa. Last year I tried to wash my hands in Cape Town, but all the taps produced was a mist. Cape Town cannot keep up with severe drought and intense population.
Those were the voices of students sharing their contribution to the My Climate Story project, an ongoing effort to capture how individuals are experiencing climate change in their own lives. This project is an initiative of the Penn Program in Environmental Humanities, or PPEH, a program that involves students in a variety of interactive and community projects to encourage thoughtful engagement on environmental challenges. We spoke with one of the program's students, Tsemone Ogbemi, about her ideas on environmental justice as they have evolved through her work with PPEH and Bethany Wiggin, the program's founder and an associate professor of Germanic languages and literatures.
So my name is Tsemone Ogbemi, and I'm a senior now and majoring in English. I think environmental justice is the way in which environmental harm is multiplied based on who you are, basically, the inequalities that already exist in a certain society. Communities of color are way more likely to be fence line communities. In other words, to be living in places where they're at risk of being subject to these kinds of toxic emissions and as a result getting sick. And there's all this evidence related to it in Philadelphia, the asthma rate being much higher than the national rate in the city. So that's a huge environmental justice issue that I think of in Philadelphia.
As Tsemone sees it, climate change is a big problem that is difficult for people to grasp, and it doesn't lend itself to one big solution. But she's become interested in what she describes as tiny solutions that may not change the world, but can address the needs of specific communities. She launched a newsletter called Imagination Machine to talk about these solutions.
So much of what we see around climate in the news or whatever kind of media we're consuming gives us an emotional reaction that's really kind of like a determining factor, I guess, in how we decide to engage with climate, or if we decide to engage with climate at all. And my thinking around that was really a big reason why I decided to start this newsletter called Imagination Machine while we were in Beyond the Lab, because I was finding out that there were people who were doing projects around climate that were more science related, or that were more art related, or that were more activism related, that didn't have an approach of doom and disaster necessarily, but that also didn't have an approach of okay, here's the solution, here's how we fix everything, and here's the answer. They were projects that were just rooted in being able to sit with the reality of climate change in different ways, how difficult that is emotionally, or what opportunities it creates for creativity, or on the scientific sides, what are some tiny, small, social or local solutions that we can think of that are not going to save the world, but are going to address the needs of the specific community and different things like that. So I started Imagination Machine to share those projects because I felt like if people were reading that, at least as I was reading it, it was like, I don't feel anymore like I have to put this kind of intense pressure on myself to know what the solution is or to be working on the solution, because climate change isn't that kind of problem.
Tsemone believes that imagination is the key to finding solutions for climate change and moving towards environmental justice, and she finds science fiction to be an inspiration for the process of imagining what a safer world might look like.
I mean, I definitely think that there's just a strong link between fiction or making art in general and activism, because like the two kinds of work have imagination in common. And someone actually brought to my attention recently, because the science fiction writer Octavia Butler is a huge, I think, inspiration for me and a lot of people when thinking about imagining kind of like safer futures and safer worlds. There's this collection of stories edited by Adrienne Marie Brown and Walida Imarisha that's called Octavia's Brood. That's kind of working in Octavia Butler's legacy of trying to imagine these alternative, kind of like expansive, safer futures for people. And in Walida Imarisha's introduction to this collection, there's a line where they say, all organizing is science fiction, which is so kind of amazing to me. The idea being that whenever we try and organize for a world that's better, that's more just than the one we live in now, we're reaching towards something that doesn't exist yet, and we're having to imagine it and kind of like use all the tools that we have at our disposal to bring it into being. And how that's very similar to what you're kind of doing when you're writing a science fiction story, bringing an alternative world into being. And so I would say that kind of writing or that kind of art making is really important to me for that reason. There's an important step that comes when you're trying to move toward, I don't know, the future, or move toward justice, or move toward anything like that. And that's imagining what it would be like to live in a different way.
The search for a radically different approach to the interconnected problems of climate change and environmental justice in the U.S. has moved from imagination to active policy debate in the past year with the Green New Deal. We spoke with Danielle Aldana Cohen, a sociologist who led research for the Green New Deal for Public Housing Act that was introduced into Congress by Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. He shared with us his sense of urgency surrounding climate change.
When I really got to understand climate science in my early 20s, I was ready emotionally to sort of take on board just how serious this problem was. I mean, fundamentally, if the climate scientists are right, then we are not just kind of moving very gradually down a slope towards a slightly worse situation, but we're skidding down a mountainside with the danger of falling off of a cliff.
While climate change is a matter of science, Professor Cohen says that its impacts on individuals and communities are connected to the same factors that drive so many forms of injustice: disparities in wealth, political influence, and opportunity.
Climate change comes really from a combination of deforestation and basically the modern economy powered by fossil fuels, including fertilizers, which are produced usually using fossil fuels. So then how does this relate to inequality? Well, in a few ways that are really important. First of all, to a wildly disproportionate extent, the richest people cause the largest share of emissions, simply because wealthier people consume more. Another piece of it is that the people who are least wealthy are disproportionately exposed to the harms of climate change. This takes many forms, but I think the easiest, most intuitive way to think about it is that people with less money and less political power are simply less able to shield themselves from the consequences of climate change. So, for example, in the United States, about 1/3 of families can't afford their utility bills. They really struggle to make their utility payments, or they get their utilities disconnected. This is a major racial justice or injustice component. In Philadelphia, about half of Black families can't afford their utility bills. And what that then means is that when you have things like heat waves, communities of color, low-income communities, really struggle to do things as simple as keeping the AC on, or if they even have access to air conditioning. And this is one of the main reasons why communities of color suffer disproportionately in terms of health and even death rates during extreme weather events like heat waves. Folks with less money and fewer resources just can't handle the impacts of climate change as much. And then there's a second set of inequalities we could think about, which have to do with where people are located. So we talked a bit before about environmental injustice, the fact that communities of color are disproportionately located near polluting facilities. And we talked about the fact that wealthier people consume more than communities of color. So there is a study in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in the United States, a journal sometimes called PNAS, that quantifies who is getting the pollution that results from the consumption of others. And it finds that on average, non-Hispanic whites, so whites who are not of Latino origin, they experience 17% less air pollution than is caused by their consumption. And on the contrary, Blacks and Latino Americans, on average, bear a pollution burden of 56% and 63% excess exposure, respectively, relative to what they consume. So in other words, in the United States, white families are consuming more. That is causing more pollution, but that pollution is being experienced physically in Black and brown communities disproportionately rather than in white communities. And I bring up those statistics just to point out that the inequality in climate change is all interconnected, that you have on the one hand more privileged and more affluent people whose consumption and way of life is causing greenhouse gas emissions and causing pollution, and then you have other communities, disproportionately communities of color and low-income communities, that are bearing the brunt of that increased pollution in the form of climate impacts, in the form of direct physical pollution, and in the form of lesser ability to withstand the shocks from extreme weather events. So there is really no disentangling the problem of climate change from the problem of inequality. And I and many others working on this are strong advocates of policies that would reduce the consumption of the affluent, that would tax the affluent more to pay for clean energy transition, and that would make disproportionate investments in communities of color and other communities that are suffering so much from pollution to kind of lift them up and to ensure that the communities that have suffered the most from pollution so far, have suffered the most from climate change so far, will benefit first and most from a new era of green investment.
With the consumption by affluent white communities driving pollution and climate change that is disproportionately harmful to poorer communities of color, Professor Cohen says that it's impossible to have a conversation about climate that doesn't recognize environmental racism.
Fundamentally, environmental inequalities that communities of color experience are inextricably connected to economic inequalities that communities of color are experiencing. And those are inextricably connected to inequalities in political power. Communities of color simply having less capability in American politics right now to get their interests met because of unequal power relations. And so the point there is to say that sometimes folks want to confine a discussion of environmental racism or environmental inequality to simply a discussion of the environment or simply a discussion of climate change. But I think we need a much more holistic vision to understand that there's ultimately no real separation between environmental racism and racism in general, between climate inequality and inequality overall.
Professor Cohen's work extends beyond research and includes advocacy for change. He says his experiences as a researcher gave him a more nuanced understanding of the challenges people face in meeting their basic needs, and how any solutions geared towards sustainability must address these daily challenges.
So I've been involved in a fair amount of policy work in the last 2 or 3 years And everything that I'm doing in terms of advocating for a Green New Deal, for housing, you name it, is really informed by the experience of almost 10 years of ethnographic research on housing movements and housing inequalities and the politics of climate change in Sao Paulo, in Brazil, and also in New York City. And what I took away from that experience was that when you have people who are fighting to get a roof over their head, who are fighting so that they are able to make rent every month, fighting to make sure that they are not forced to live 2 or 3 hours each way from their job in horrible congestion. When you have those groups fighting just basically for the right to live well in a city and for the right to decent, affordable housing, those struggles are virtually every single time totally consistent with the best possible version of a low-carbon city, which is a city where people live close to where they work, with full access to public transit, with short commutes, and in affordable housing that is sustainable, that is energy efficient, that is healthy.
The proposals that are part of the Green New Deal for Public Housing Act reflect what Professor Cohen describes as approaching the problem from the inside out, delivering on environmental justice by starting first with a focus on people's everyday lives.
No one that I've talked to in New York public housing, they want a climate change emergency to end. They want to live in a stable climate, but they wake up in the morning and they are living in apartments in appalling conditions of public, neglect. And what I've learned from doing research with people who are in housing movements and just in situations where people have very bad housing is I think I've learned something about communicating and getting feedback from people in those situations on climate policy. I've come to understand that in New York public housing, the conversation doesn't start with how many carbon emissions are coming out of the building. It starts with, what is the state of disrepair in your apartment? How could we make it better? Do you even have access to air conditioning? Which in New York public housing, very often the answer is no. And we kind of build out from there and say, well, what if all of your appliances were electric, energy efficient, cutting edge, electric induction stoves, no toxic gas in your kitchen? People say, it sounds good. And then people will say, well, you have to change the law though, because right now the government is only buying the lowest cost, worst quality appliances because of procurement rules. And, you have gas stoves exploding in people's kitchens 3 years after they were bought because they're such low quality. And so that tells us, oh, okay, if we want to do, policy that is intersectional, that tackles housing, racial injustice, tackles climate at the same time, then we have to adjust the way that we invest in our public housing. We have to do it in a slightly different way. We have to look around the world for examples of how to do it better. So long story short, after going along on this long discussion of housing and climate policy, I think I've kind of learned from my engagement with housing communities, with social movements in Brazil and in the United States, a way to tackle climate change from the inside out, from building out from the ordinary everyday problems that communities of color and working class communities are facing. And from those problems, find ways to link those to the low carbon agenda. And then you end up with a kind of beautifully rounded intersectional climate justice policy approach, which is yielding really important benefits in other countries around the world. And I think that with sufficient investment from the public sector in the United States, we could be seeing really beautiful results in terms of low carbon green housing, and then we could see something analogous with transportation, with energy, with agriculture, et cetera. There's a huge amount of possibility here, and it really does come from connecting the climate agenda to the needs and desires of ordinary people, and in particular people of color who suffered the most from disinvestment in this country so far.
Understanding the social roots of environmental racism and injustice leads towards policy solutions that are not always immediately connected to environmental activism, but Professor Cohen argues they are critical to change.
To further environmental justice, I think we really need to do two things. One is to make sure that we get the right outcomes, right? That means that nobody is breathing in toxic air, that nobody's life is shortened because of asthma, nobody's life is shortened because of contamination from toxins, whether that's mercury or PFAS or asbestos or lead, you name it, right? We have schools in Philadelphia right now where, before the pandemic, students were wearing masks because of the air quality, because of the scandalous neglect of those facilities. So, to deliver environmental justice, we have to have our eyes on the outcomes. We have to make sure that we know where we're going and that we get there and that we can measure our progress along the way. The second thing that we need to do to deliver environmental justice is we have to intervene on the fundamental causes of environmental injustice. And that means that I think we have to go and look at the communities that are suffering the most and ask, why are they suffering so much? And if one of the reasons they're suffering is that there is a lack of income, a lack of political capability, then those are the things that we need public policy to provide. Unionizing workers in communities of color will provide those communities more money, more investment, ultimately, that will help them to fight for their own interests and ultimately have more control over what happens when investments land in their communities. Providing something like universal health care would make life cheaper, substantially cheaper for a large number of working class people of color in this country. And that would free them up, give them more time and more resources to go out and to have control over what goes on in their community. Investing in childcare support, investing in better education, you name it. And so my point there is that, again, when we see these things holistically, the problem looks harder to solve. We understand that environmental injustice is not just a question about smokestacks, but it's really a question about wealth and income inequality, which has a huge racial dimension in the United States.
In assessing the prospects of achieving environmental justice in the foreseeable future, Professor Cohen sees the current moment as a time of formidable challenge, but also of great opportunity.
I think this is in some ways a very depressing time to be in looking at politics and to see how bad the climate emergency is and to see how violent the racism in this country is. But on the flip side, I see a huge number of movements who are fighting to write a new future, that they're making a huge amount of political headway, making some economic headway, and I think we have a chance to see in the years ahead some really dramatic changes in communities in this country and in countries around the world. And I think we should all be so lucky to be a part of that change.
This concludes Episode 5, Environmental Justice and Race. Join us in 2 weeks for our 6th episode, Repair, where we'll hear from a graduating senior who researched connections between Penn, slavery, and the medical industry, and a doctoral candidate in philosophy who specializes in moral philosophy, bioethics, and philosophy of race. In These Times is a production of Penn Arts and Sciences. Special thanks to Professors Herman Beavers and Danielle Aldana Cohen, and Tsemone Ogbemi. I'm Alex Shine. Thanks for listening. To hear the full 1.5-minute climate lectures mentioned in this episode, visit the series page on the Penn Arts and Sciences website, or click the link in this episode's description. And be sure to subscribe to the Omnia podcast by Penn Arts and Sciences on Apple iTunes, or wherever you find your podcasts, to listen to all 6 episodes of Season 2 of In These Times, Black Lives and the Call for Justice.